Farmers in China's Xinjiang province are turning a desert into a thriving farmland.
Scientists dropped millions of fish into a salt lake in the middle of the driest desert in all of Asia. The Taklamakan gets under 4 inches of rain a year and loses 118 to evaporation. Sea bream, grouper, shrimp by the million, 1,000 miles from the nearest coast, in water too salty to drink and too salty to grow anything in. By every reasonable expectation, they should have been dead inside a month. A year later, almost all of them were still alive, and nobody had taken the salt out of that water. Nobody even tried. The Sea of Death. The Taklamakan sits in the far northwest of China, and the people living around its edge call it the Sea of Death. That gap between the rain and the evaporation works out to roughly 30 times more water leaving this place than arrives in it. Sandstorms bury the roads every spring, sand ridges sitting on every single horizon. Nothing out there says fish. But out where the open dunes give way to a belt of white salt crust, somebody built ponds. Just after dawn, a worker walks the line of them with a probe, reading one and moving on to the next. The same round every morning before the heat arrives. These are not laboratory tanks, not a demonstration project dressed up for visiting officials. Production ponds sitting in open desert. The first stocking put 100,000 fry into them. Sea bream, grouper, mud skippers, animals that evolved in ocean water and die quickly in anything that is not. The number the operators reported a year later was 99% survival. Sit with that number for a second because it is not a good result for aquaculture. It is an absurd one. Coastal farms with a real ocean sitting next door lose more stock than that in a normal season. Out here, with no ocean to draw from and no wild population anywhere within 1,000 miles to restock from, keeping them alive should not really have been possible. And it is worth saying plainly that the figure comes from the operators, not an independent audit. The fish were not even the strangest part. By the middle of the last decade, the average income for somebody working in fisheries in Xinjiang had climbed past 16,000 yuan a year, several $100s ahead of the farmers working the land around them. In one of the driest regions on the planet, fishing paid better than farming, which raises the obvious question. This is the desert. Where is the water even coming from? It turns out the place is a lot less empty than it looks. Xinjiang is enormous, more than 600,000 square miles, and only around 1/10 of it is genuinely livable. Scattered through the rest are rivers running off the mountains, reservoirs, and a chain of salt lakes. Add the surface water together, and the region holds something in the order of 2,000 square miles of it. More water surface than the entire land area of Delaware, sitting in a place whose capital is farther from the sea than any other city on Earth. Those waters already supported more than 500 species of small organisms. There was already a food web out there, waiting for something to eat it. Here is the deal though, and it is the reason nobody had bothered for the previous century. The water was useless, too salty to drink, too salty for crops, sitting in saline alkaline soil where almost nothing grows and which quietly wrecks the water quality on top of it. Useless ground holding useless water, which is where this stops being a story about a desert and turns into a story about chemistry. The missing ions. It started at a place called Hongchai Farm with a fairly bold experiment. The default answer to salty water, forever, has been to take the salt out. Desalination is expensive, slow, and energy hungry. So the researchers asked a different question. What if the problem was never how much salt was in the water, but which salts? Seawater is a specific mixture, and the ratios in it matter enormously to anything breathing through gills. After a long run of trials, funded partly by Guangdong province thousands of miles away on the actual coast, the teams worked out what the desert water was short of. Calcium, magnesium, and potassium ions mostly. All cheap, all harmless to human health. Dose the lake water with the right ions, run it through a purpose-built circulation system. And what comes out the other end is close enough to ocean water that a grouper cannot tell the difference. They never tried to take the salt out. They put the missing pieces in. That single reframe is the hinge the whole industry swings on, and it produced a stack of patents along the way. The salinity in some of Xinjiang's natural water already sits near seawater levels. Somebody just had to work out what was missing. If this is doing something for you, subscribe. I go looking for stories like this one every week, and the only reason I get to keep doing it is that people stick around, which still leaves the hardest part, and nobody puts this one in the promotional footage: the weather. Somewhere in a regional meteorological bureau, a forecaster sits with a 48-hour window open across the desert farming belt, watching for sandstorms, heat waves, cold snaps, and high winds, and picks the day the fry travel. That person never touches a fish. That call decides whether the batch lives, because moving live juvenile fish across that kind of distance is the single highest mortality step in the entire chain. Get the timing wrong, and you lose them before they reach a pond. So, the Bureau built a monitoring network across the farming areas and started issuing those forecasts written specifically for aquaculture operators, which gives a farmer time to cover ponds before the sky arrives. On the construction side, the research teams built a control system that holds pond water between roughly 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter what the air outside is doing. Chemistry solved, weather handled. Which leaves the one thing everybody out here is supposed to be fighting, and it turns out to be the most valuable asset on the books. Why the desert helps. Now here is where most people get this backwards. The desert looks like an obstacle these people heroically overcame. For this particular industry, the desert is doing real work. Start with disease, the recurring nightmare of marine aquaculture. The reason is proximity. A coastal farm sits in open water connected to wild populations, other farms, shipping traffic, and river outflow. Pathogens arrive whether you invite them or not. That is what the antibiotics are for. A pond in the middle of the Taklamakan has no wild population within 1,000 miles and no natural route in. The isolation that makes the place miserable to live in is the same isolation that makes it a clean room, and that matters commercially far more than it sounds. Export buyers in Japan and Europe test for antibiotic residue, and a failed test can close a market for a season. A farm that needs less medicine clears customs faster and holds its markets longer. When you hear that foreign buyers pay a premium for Chinese desert seafood, part of that premium is a paperwork premium. Then the temperatures swing. The desert runs hot in the day and drops hard at night, and you would call that a hardship. For a controlled pond, it is closer to an asset. Cold nights slow biological processes you do not want running, and a wide daily range gives operators more room to steer water temperature than a flat, humid coast ever would. Add the sunlight, and you have growing conditions a coastal farm would need machinery to imitate. And the water goes in clean. No industrial outfall upstream, no shipping lanes, nothing draining off a populated coastline. Chinese consumers have spent recent years paying close attention to what goes into the ocean their seafood comes out of. And a product that never touched an ocean has a marketing position no coastal competitor can copy. So, the sand, the silence, and the killing heat are all working for you. Which sounds like a free lunch, and out here nothing is. The bill for all of it lands somewhere else entirely. Where the money went. Because none of this exists out of romance about conquering nature. It exists because it pays. Since the late 2010s, government policy has pushed private investment into aquaculture across the northwestern provinces, with a stated goal of turning an arid interior into a serious production region. In 2023, Xinjiang produced around 183,000 tons of aquatic products, worth near $530 million, highest output of any of the 5 provincial-level regions in China's northwest. Online retail came in above $50 million in the same period, up roughly a sixth on the year before. Water suitable for fish farming, spread around the deserts, now covers more than 185,000 acres, slightly less than the land area of New York City. Local government expects the total value of the industry to approach $3 billion. Now, that is a projection, not a receipt, and the money reaches further down than the export figures suggest. Salmon farming alone has put several thousand people into work out there. In one operation, it adds a couple of $1,000s a year to each of 30 local households, and that count grows every time a new species goes into the ponds. In a region where plenty of farmers had never eaten a fish in their lives at the start of this century, that is a strange sentence to say out loud. But there is a constraint in all of this that almost nobody mentions. The bottleneck out here was never water. It is feed and freight. Fish do not manufacture protein out of sunlight. Somewhere far to the east, a driver backs a truck up to a dock, watches feed sacks go into a container, signs for the load, and pulls out. That container then crosses 2,000 miles of rail inland before a single fish eats what is inside it. Then the finished product rides most of that distance back out to reach the cities that will pay for it. Every kilogram produced in the Taklamakan carries a transport bill. A farm on the southeast coast simply does not pay. Look at the species list with that in mind, and it stops looking random. Salmon, grouper, king prawn, abalone, lobster, green crab, and now pearls. Nobody out here farms cheap fish because cheap fish cannot survive the freight. High value per kilogram is the entry requirement. That also explains why this model has not spread to every desert on Earth. Copying it needs three things at once: existing saline surface water, which plenty of arid basins have; cheap, reliable power for pumps and heaters running continuously, which fewer have; and a freight link fast enough to move chilled protein to a wealthy city before it spoils, which almost none have. Xinjiang spent 2 decades building rail, aviation, and logistics capacity for reasons that had nothing to do with fish, and the farms are riding on top of all of it, which means this whole industry is only ever as solid as the line running underneath it. And the biggest operation out there is betting more money on that line than anybody else. Salmon in sand, which brings us to the salmon. A company called Tianyun has built full-cycle salmon farming out here, running somewhere around 40 million fry a year, with annual capacity near 12,000 tons. They developed the country's first underwater cleaning robot, and were the first in China to build a semi-closed recirculating system, meaning the water gets filtered and reused rather than drawn and dumped. Fish move from harvest to a customer's table in under a day. One honest note on the word salmon. A great deal of what sells under that name inside China is rainbow trout, raised in cold fresh water rather than the sea. And the labeling has been argued about publicly for years. It does not make the engineering less impressive. It does mean the fish on the plate may not be the fish you are picturing, and none of this appeared overnight. Rainbow trout went into the Ili River Valley in western Xinjiang back in the 1970s. Sarum Lake had no fish in it at all until 1998, when a local outfit introduced northern whitefish brought in from Russia. And hatching survival that first year ran at about 3%. In 2000, the Fisheries Authority put something over $500,000 into a breeding facility and then spent a decade optimizing incubation. Survival climbed from 3% to 36%, 10 years for that. The lake now moves several hundred tons a year, with fish taking 3 to 4 years to reach a market weight above 2 pounds. Elsewhere it came faster. One farm settled on tilapia and cleared about $1 million off 165 acres of ponds and 650,000 fish. At Boston Lake, the crab harvest broke every previous record in 2023, and by late 2024, 6 cooperatives were running over 400,000 fish across 8 species, 300,000 green crabs, and nearly 5 million shrimp. And this next part is the part that gets me. The Pearl Project launched back in 2012, with investors farming around 2 million oysters and first sales expected in the second half of last year. Organic. Waste from the fish gets converted into amino acids and nitrates, which feed aquatic plants, which feed the oysters, which filter the water and cut the purification cost for everybody upstream. The oysters are a water treatment stage that happens to produce jewelry. And it is not only fish coming out of that sand. Ordinary rice collapses under salt and alkali stress. Salt-tolerant rice does not. In 2018, a research group opened experimental fields on some of the most saline ground in the region, and by the following year, an assessment group measured a little over 8 tons off 2.5 acres, with around 2,000 acres planted that season. The yield is not even the interesting result. After the right variety was established, salinity in the test fields dropped several times over. The rice was repairing the ground it grew in, ground healing, water working, money moving, and then the desert did something nobody had planned for. When the desert flooded, starting in 2021, the Taklamakan began to flood every summer. That July, water covered more than 100 square miles of desert, breaching dams and knocking down power poles. The following summer, the Tarim and its tributaries flooded again. By 2024, footage of water pouring across desert highways was circulating widely, because that is not a thing deserts are supposed to do. Meteorologists put it down to a mixed cause. Prolonged high temperatures across southern Xinjiang, well above 95 degrees Fahrenheit and past 104 in places. Melted glaciers and snowpack, and heavy rain landed on top. Free water delivered annually. Surely that fixes the desert. It does not. And this is the part that decides everything. Sand does not hold water the way clay does, so it drains. Evaporation out here beats rainfall by around 30-1, so whatever stays gets taken back by the sky within weeks. And most of that floodwater is melted glacier, a withdrawal from an account nobody is refilling, which means the water arriving now is the same water that will not arrive later. And every pond in this story sits downstream of it. Fish versus cotton. So here is what actually happened out there, and it is stranger than making a desert bloom. Nobody made this desert fertile. Nothing out there turned sand into farmland. Salt lake water sitting in the driest ground in Asia turned out to be 3 cheap ions away from being ocean. And the emptiness everybody treats as a curse turned out to be the cleanest water a fish farm can ask for. The desert is not being farmed. It is being used for its sunlight and its isolation and its temperature swing, while the systems route around everything else. And that is exactly why the next part matters. The question that decides how long this holds has nothing to do with sand. It comes down to the water budget of the Tarim Basin, which already has more claims on it than it has water, where every new pond shares a river with cotton, one of the thirstiest crops anybody grows at that latitude. And the glaciers feeding that river are thinning. In the same decade, the ponds are multiplying. Recirculating systems help, because a sealed loop draws a fraction of what an open pond does. That is exactly why the expensive technology keeps showing up out here, rather than on the coast. Out here, the water bill is the whole business. Back at that pond, the valve opens again at dawn, and the water running through it comes off the same river the cotton is drinking. So the fish are not competing with the desert, they are competing with the cotton. And that is a fight the desert never got a say in. If you want more stories where the impossible turns out to be an engineering invoice somebody quietly paid, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, when the glaciers thin out and there is not enough river left for both, who should get the water, the fish, or the cotton?